I'm Ethan, and I thought moving in with my new roommate Clara would be easy. But the first night she disappeared into the shadows of our apartment, and that's when the watching began. Now every creak, every whisper, every flicker of light feels like she's still here, or something wearing her face. I moved into the apartment thinking it would be a fresh start. The rent was cheap, and the building seemed quiet enough. My roommate's name was Alex. I hadn't met him yet, but the landlord assured me he was a normal guy, keeps to himself. I told myself that was all I needed to know. I liked quiet. I liked my own space. The first night, I unpacked my bags, setting up my corner of the small apartment, trying to ignore the emptiness that seemed to stretch across the living room. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, and the air had that faint smell of dust mixed with something metallic I couldn't identify. I slept fitfully that first night, half expecting to hear someone moving around. The apartment was old, with thin floors and creaking beams, and every small sound seemed amplified. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard a soft shuffle from the other room, maybe the bathroom. I froze, holding my breath. Nothing happened. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe a mouse, and tried to push the unease aside. The next morning, I noticed something odd. My cereal box was slightly open, though I hadn't touched it. I stared at it for a long time, feeling my stomach tighten. I told myself it was probably just a careless packaging mistake, but a small part of me felt like it had been moved deliberately. I shrugged it off and poured myself a bowl, pretending everything was normal. Days passed, and the small things kept happening. A chair slightly moved out of place. My keys weren't where I left them. My toothbrush had shifted on the counter. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I had always been a little anxious, and living alone, even with a roommate I hadn't met, might be heightening that anxiety. But the feeling of being watched started to grow inside me, twisting into something I couldn't ignore. I would sit in the living room, staring at the hallway, expecting to see someone emerge, but it was always empty. One night, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, every nerve screaming. The apartment was empty, except for me and Alex, who I hadn't seen all day. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. Heart racing, I crept to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty, the dim light from the street lamps casting long shadows along the walls. I whispered his name in my head, feeling ridiculous, and stepped back into my room. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, and then, the footsteps again. Softer this time, closer, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I told myself it was just the apartment, old floors creaking, nothing more. But my eyes darted to the corner, to the shadows that seemed to bend unnaturally, and I shivered. A week in, I started noticing something even stranger. When I left my bedroom for a few minutes, things in my room would be slightly different. A book wasn't quite where I left it. My jacket had been moved to the chair by the window. I hadn't been sleepwalking. I was careful. I began keeping a small notebook, writing down the position of everything before I left the room. But it didn't help. Every time I returned, something had shifted again. Then came the first dream. I woke up sweating, heart pounding. I had dreamed of someone breathing in my ear, whispering words I couldn't understand. When I sat up, I felt something wet on my shoulder. My hand flew to its sticky, clammy end. I froze, my skin prickled. There was no one there. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear anything. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to move, but my body felt paralyzed. Only the wetness remained, clinging to my skin, and I realized, with a cold sinking feeling, that I was utterly alone. I turned on every light in the apartment, inspecting every corner, every shadow. Nothing but the air felt heavier, the silence thicker. And then I noticed the reflection in the living room mirror. I froze. Something had been standing behind me, just a faint shape, but unmistakable. I spun around. The room was empty. The walls stared back at me with the same blank indifference, and yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I finally collapsed into bed, shaking, unable to sleep, unable to convince myself it was all imagination. I didn't know what was worse, the thought that someone was in the apartment with me, or the idea that whatever it was, it had been here long before I arrived. I pulled the covers over my head, heart hammering, and tried not to breathe too loudly. Somewhere, in the dark, I could hear the faintest scrape of a fingernail against wood. It wasn't my imagination. After that night, I started noticing Alex's habits, or maybe the absence of them. He never seemed to leave the apartment. Sometimes, I would get home from work and the place would be completely silent. No sounds of showers, cooking, or movement. Other times, I would swear I heard shuffling, the faint creak of floors above or behind me. But when I checked, the rooms were empty. I tried to convince myself that maybe he had odd work hours, or maybe he was out and returned silently. But then I realized I had never actually met him in person. The landlord had shown me the lease, given me his name, and assured me he was normal. I had taken that at face value, and now I was beginning to question everything. The first real scare came when I returned home one evening and found my laptop on the kitchen table. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the screen was open to a photo of me sleeping. My stomach dropped. I had no cameras set up, no webcams, no security devices. How had this picture been taken? I scanned the apartment, checking every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. No Alex, no intruder. Nothing. Just the lingering scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic that made my throat dry. I wanted to leave, to run out of the apartment and never return, but something held me back. Some strange curiosity, or maybe fear too deep to fight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake on the couch, lights on, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then I heard its soft footsteps in the hall outside the living room. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped, then continued, moving closer to the bedroom. My heart raced. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the hallway, but the floorboards beneath me didn't creak. Whoever or whatever was moving around didn't make the sounds a normal person would. The apartment started changing in ways I couldn't explain. Food began disappearing. My cereal, my milk, even snacks I hadn't opened were gone or left half-eaten. Lights flickered in corners of the apartment where there were no switches or wiring. I could swear I saw shadows moving in the corner of my eye, slinking across the walls and ceilings, vanishing when I looked directly at them. At first I thought I was losing my mind, but the sense of being watched, the creeping awareness that I was never alone, made it impossible to deny. One night I decided to set up a small camera in the living room, hoping to catch Alex or whoever it was in the act. I positioned it carefully, angled just right to cover the doorway, the windows, and the sofa. I went to bed with the camera running, a strange mixture of fear and anticipation keeping me awake longer than usual. Around 2 a.m. I woke to a movement in the darkness. At first, it seemed nothing, a trick of the shadows, but then I remembered the camera. I could see the faint red light blinking, recording. I watched the footage later, and my stomach dropped. At first it was nothing but empty rooms, the living room dark and quiet. Then a figure appeared, crawling along the floor. Its movements were wrong, unnatural, almost jerky, like it had too many joints. I could barely make out the shape, but I knew it was humanoid. It moved toward the camera slowly, deliberately. When it stopped, it turned its head. I couldn't see a face in detail, but the shape of it had no eyes, just smooth, empty sockets staring at me through the lens, and I felt something in me twist, a terror I couldn't name. I shut off the camera immediately and nearly vomited. I didn't want to watch anymore, didn't want to know what was in my apartment. But even after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. Every corner, every shadow, every floorboard seemed alive. I began sleeping in different rooms, on the floor, on the couch, anywhere but my bed. But even then, I would wake to the sensation of someone watching me, breathing near me, even though the apartment was silent. Then I noticed scratches along the baseboards, thin, shallow lines, etched in patterns I didn't recognize, as if someone or something had been crawling around on all fours, studying the apartment, studying me. The scratches appeared in places I hadn't noticed before, near doors, windows, and along the hallway. Each time I tried to clean them, they seemed to return overnight, as if the apartment itself was alive, reshaping itself around the presence. I started hearing whispers at night, low, indecipherable murmurs that slithered along the walls, sometimes seeming to come from inside my own head. I would cover my ears, scream silently, and yet the whispers persisted. One night, the whispering stopped entirely, and in the silence, I heard a different sound, a scraping, dragging movement, coming from directly behind my bedroom door. I froze, paralyzed. Slowly, the door creaked open, and the dark shape of a figure slipped inside, then vanished, leaving only the stench of decay lingering in the air. I lay awake the rest of the night, paralyzed, heart hammering, staring at the shadows. I had no idea what I was dealing with. I didn't even know if Alex was real, or if he had ever been real at all. And when the first rays of morning light filtered through the window, the feeling of being watched did not fade. It had only grown stronger, more patient, as if whatever was in the apartment had been waiting for me all along. I couldn't stop thinking about the camera footage. The memory of that eyeless figure, crawling along the floor, haunted every moment. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, some optical illusion, but deep down I knew I had seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. I avoided the living room, sat in the corners, and kept every light on, but even then, I could feel it. The apartment wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it knew I was afraid. That morning I woke up to a note on my pillow. It was written in messy, jagged handwriting, the kind that looked rushed and almost frantic. It said, "You shouldn't be here alone." I dropped the note, my hands trembling. I didn't know if it was a joke, some sick prank, or a warning. But the handwriting was unfamiliar, not Alex's or anyone I knew. I checked the apartment from top to bottom, searching for another clue, another sign of someone hiding. Nothing, just the same shadows stretching across the walls, the same faint metallic smell lingering in the air. I began noticing small, sinister changes around the apartment. Things that weren't there before now existed, as if the space itself was reshaping to torment me. Objects moved, lights flickered, and shapes slithered at the edges of my vision. I started keeping a journal, trying to document every strange occurrence, every whisper, every flicker of movement. It didn't make me feel safer. It only made the apartment seem more alive, more intelligent, as if it was learning about me, learning my fears. One night, I returned from work to find my laptop open again, this time displaying dozens of photos. They were all of me, from different angles, taken at different times. Some were from that very day. My stomach churned. Someone had been watching me constantly, studying my routines, my habits, and there was no sign of the observer. I turned off the laptop and hid it in the closet, but the unease didn't leave. The apartment felt like a cage. I decided to set up a camera again, this time in the hallway, to catch anything or anyone moving in the apartment while I slept. I positioned it carefully, covering every doorway and angle, then forced myself to lie down. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. At 3 a.m., I woke to a soft, shuffling sound. It wasn't footsteps. It was slower, deliberate, almost predatory. I held my breath, every muscle in my body rigid, and listened. The sound came closer, curling around the bedroom door, pausing, then retreating. The next morning, I checked the footage. My stomach turned as I watched. At first, the hallway was empty. Then, the figure appeared, crouched and crawling along the floor again. Its movements were wrong, unnatural, jerky, almost like it had too many joints. It stopped in the doorway, turned its head toward the camera, and I froze. Its face, it had no eyes, just smooth, black hollows staring directly into the lens. I could feel it watching me through the screen, and a part of me wanted to destroy the camera, to erase the evidence, but another part couldn't look away. I began obsessing over the scratches along the baseboards. They were getting longer, deeper, more deliberate. Some looked like they had been clawed into the walls, forming patterns I couldn't understand. It felt like a language, a warning, or maybe a countdown. I traced them with my fingers, shivering, but the lines felt alive, as if the apartment itself were reaching out. One night I woke to whispering, low and insidious, echoing through the walls. It wasn't words I could understand, but the tone made my skin crawl. I pulled the covers over my head, but it didn't stop. The whispers grew louder, circling me, coming from inside my own mind. Then I heard a dragging sound, something being pulled across the floor. My bedroom door creaked open slowly, and I knew before looking that the figure was there. It didn't move like a person. Its body was wrong, contorted, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. It stopped at the foot of my bed, its face tilted toward me, the hollow sockets empty and infinite. And then I noticed something more terrifying. It wasn't breathing. There was no pulse, and yet the air around it was thick, rancid, filled with the smell of rot, decay, and something metallic. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My chest ached with the need for air, for escape, but my body refused to move. I could feel its presence leaning into me, studying me, and then it simply vanished. The room was empty again, silent except for the lingering stench. I sat up, trembling, realizing that whatever was in the apartment, whatever had been watching me for weeks, wasn't human. And then I noticed the walls. Scratches had multiplied overnight, forming a crude circle around my bed. Inside the circle, etched deep into the floor, were letters I didn't recognize, but I could feel them, vibrating with some strange energy, as if the apartment itself were alive, aware of my fear, and waiting. I didn't know how I would survive the nights to come. I had started avoiding every corner of the apartment that felt familiar. The place I thought was safe had transformed into a labyrinth of fear. Every creak, every whisper of the wind against the windows felt deliberate, like it was part of a larger plan I couldn't understand. I couldn't tell if Alex was real or if he ever had been, but the presence in the apartment, whatever it was no longer subtle. It was bold, almost taunting. I decided to research the apartment building, desperate for answers. Old newspaper articles, online forums, city records, anything. Most of it was mundane. Maintenance logs, property sales, tenant complaints. But one article made my blood run cold. A young man had vanished from this exact unit years ago. No body, no witnesses, no explanation. The neighbors claimed they heard strange sounds at night before he disappeared. The building management dismissed it as imagination, but the details matched too closely. The strange noises, the feeling of being watched, the footprints that left no traces. The thought that history might be repeating itself clawed at me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, scanning the apartment like a predator might scan a room. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, growing longer than they should have, creeping toward me in subtle, impossible ways. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the corners of my vision, but when I turned my head, nothing was there. My heart pounded, my hands shook, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness that seemed alive. Sleep eventually came, though not in the normal sense. I dreamed of Alex, or what I thought was Alex. He stood in the corner of my bedroom, silent, his eyes fixed on me, but his shadow moved independently, writhing like smoke, curling along the walls, reaching toward me. I tried to call out, but no sound came. My body was heavy, trapped under some invisible weight. The shadows grew thicker, coiling around me, pressing against my skin. I woke drenched in sweat, lungs aching. and the apartment was silent, or so it seemed. The silence didn't last. Slowly I became aware of a subtle scent filling the room, a combination of rot and metal, so sharp it made my eyes water. I turned toward the bedroom doorway, heart hammering, and froze. There he was. Alex saw the thing, pretending to be him, standing at the foot of my bed. His posture was unnatural, stiff, and wrong. His head tilted in a way that made my stomach twist, and his face was grotesque, stretched in impossible ways, features twisted, eyes hollow yet somehow burning with awareness. I couldn't move. My body had betrayed me again. I wanted to scream, to run, to flee, but I couldn't. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with some unholy presence. I wanted to close my eyes, to make it go away, but I couldn't. And then, slowly, I realized the worst part. The walls were no longer silent observers. They had become part of the horror. The scratches along the baseboards had multiplied, spreading up the walls, across the ceiling, forming strange, jagged symbols I couldn't comprehend. They vibrated with some unspoken menace, as if the apartment itself were alive, watching, preparing. Then I saw it, something I can never unsee. Along the walls, faint outlines appeared, like shadows trapped just beneath the surface of the paint. They moved subtly, as though something or many things were pressed against the walls from the inside, straining to escape. I felt their presence, patient and intelligent, aware of me in a way that made my blood run cold. The air thickened, oppressive, carrying a low, almost inaudible hum that resonated through my chest. I could feel it vibrating inside me, shaking me to the core. The figure at the foot of my bed raised one hand slowly, and the shadows along the walls seemed to reach toward it, almost converging, as though the apartment itself answered its command. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that the apartment and Alex were connected. One could not exist without the other. The thought sent a wave of nausea over me, and then, something truly horrifying happened. The shadows lifted off the walls, coalescing into shapes, moving in the air like black smoke. They circled me, whispering in voices that were not human, speaking words I couldn't understand. Yet every syllable carried meaning, as if they were reading my thoughts, knowing my fears. The figure Lex tilted his head backward slowly, the hollow eyes focusing on me, and a soft scraping sound began from beneath the bed. I leaned closer, heart hammering, stomach in knots. My gaze followed the noise. Something was moving in the darkness, under the bed, something alive, writhing, waiting. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that the apartment was preparing. It had been preparing for me all along. The last thing I saw before I shut my eyes in terror was the figure, as face stretching wider than humanly possible, a twisted grin forming where no lips should exist, and the shadows crawling toward the bed, wrapping around the corners like black smoke. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat. I didn't leave my room. I only waited, heart hammering, for whatever was coming next, knowing it would not be gentle, knowing I was no longer the predator in this apartment, but the prey. By now, I had stopped leaving my apartment. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant, like it existed on another plane, while the horrors inside consumed me. Every corner, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards kept me on edge. I hadn't seen Alex in days or maybe weeks, but his presence, or whatever he truly was everywhere. It waited for me in the corners, behind the doors, beneath the floor, and sometimes I could feel it directly on my skin, cold and clammy, as if it had crawled through the walls. I began setting up every camera I could find, lining them along the hallway, the living room, even the bedroom. I wanted proof, evidence that I wasn't losing my mind, but each camera I installed failed. The lenses became black, the screens went dead, and sometimes I could swear the cameras themselves were moving slightly, angling toward me as if aware of my presence. I tried to keep a journal, documenting every sound, every movement, every shadow. It didn't help. It only confirmed what I already feared. I was trapped. The apartment wasn't haunted. It was alive, and it wanted something from me. One morning I woke to the sound of running water in the bathroom. I didn't remember turning anything on. My stomach twisted as I crept toward the door, knife in hand, my chest tight with fear. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and froze. Alex, or the thing that wore his face, was standing there, not moving like a person, but still, two rigid limbs bent unnaturally. Its head was tilted all the way back, exposing the hollows of its eyes like endless pits, empty yet somehow aware. The smell hit me first, decayed flesh, iron, rot. I gagged, backing away, but my feet caught on the rug, and I stumbled to the floor. The figure remained silent, staring at me with that impossible gaze. Then my eyes swept the bathroom. The walls were covered in scratches, deep, long, clawed lines forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. Some of them were letters, others symbols, twisted and jagged. I realized with a cold, hollow certainty that my name was etched into them. My heart thumped like a hammer. It had been marking me, studying me, preparing me for something I didn't want to imagine. I scrambled to leave the bathroom, and that's when I noticed the mirrors. Every reflective surface in the apartment had changed. They no longer reflected me. They reflected the shadows, the shapes crawling along the walls, the flickering forms that slithered at the edges of my vision. In each reflection, Alex's figure appeared, watching me. Sometimes it was closer than reality, sometimes impossibly distant. I couldn't escape it, couldn't hide. Desperation took hold. I ran to the living room, thinking to throw open the front door and escape, but I froze in the doorway. The cameras I had set up were gone. Every electronic device, every phone, every recording tool, all vanished without a trace. The apartment had swallowed them. In their place, deep gouges had been etched into the wooden floor, forming words that burned themselves into my memory. "You're next." I sank to the floor, hands over my face, and tried to make sense of it. I had thought I was watching, but I had never truly been the observer. The apartment had been watching me all along. Every movement, every fear, every sleepless night, it had catalogued me, learned me, and now it had marked me. Time lost meaning. Hours or days passed, I couldn't tell. The shadows moved freely now, wrapping around furniture, sliding along walls, stretching toward me. The hollow figure remained at the edge of my vision, always present, always patient. I realized something horrifying. Alex had never existed. He was just a mask, a vessel for whatever entity had made this apartment its home. I tried to leave, tried to step beyond the threshold of the apartment, but the front door led nowhere. Every exit had vanished. The building itself had shifted, reshaped, trapping me inside. I was alone, but not really alone. The apartment pulsed with awareness, and the shadows whispered my name with voices that weren't human, voices that promised I would not escape. In a final act of desperation, I ran to the bedroom, grabbed my bag, and tried to hide. But the shadows followed, crawling over the floor, climbing the walls, filling the room with suffocating darkness. I could feel something brush against my shoulder, cold and wet, and I knew it had been waiting, patient. For the moment, I could no longer resist. I don't know how long I stayed there, pressed against the wall, paralyzed with fear. I only know that when I dared to open my eyes, the room was empty again. But the writing on the walls had multiplied. New scratches, new symbols, deeper than before, and at the center I could barely make out a single word that wasn't there before. Soon I left the apartment that day, or I thought I did. I don't remember stepping outside, only the memory of the shadows pressing against me, watching, always patient. I have moved since, to a new city, a new apartment, but sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of shapes at the edge of my vision, reflections that aren't my own, whispers in the walls, and a faint metallic smell lingering in the air. I can't stop wondering if it followed me, if it learned my routines, if it waits in silence, watching, patient, until it decides to mock me again. I thought I had escaped, but now, I'm not so sure. And every night, when I turn off the lights, I hear it, patient, waiting, whispering my name. And I know, deep down, it will come back.